Hello, good morning. By good fortune, it happens that Nancy lives about 5 minutes from us in California. That was just by chance. We just wish she were there more often. First, I would like to offer my sincere gratitude to Sonu Shamdasani and all of the Philemon scholars, along with the many contributors who have supported their efforts. Foundational to the collected works, their careful, detailed research has continued so that we have access to a wealth of fascinating information that further contextualizes Jung's evolving ideas. And we have benefited greatly from the recent publication of the Black Books. Further, I extend congratulations on the upcoming launch of Philemon's Volume 2 of Jung's ETH lectures called Consciousness and the Unconscious, edited by our dear friend Ernst Faltsader. Many thanks to the Foundation for the works of C.G. Jung, who have collaborated to make available such valuable information. It's wonderful to see you again here, Thomas, after our adventures with art and psyche in Santa Barbara, and welcome to Carl Jung in your new position. Murray Stein and Thomas Arts have continued on with current writings by authors from around the world inspired by the Red Book, and this conference is taking place thanks to their committed dedication to expanding and deepening our appreciation of Jung's exploration from varying contemporary perspectives. Your moving opening on Thursday, Murray, made manifest the spirit and soul of both Jung and your dear friend Thomas Arts. I also wish to thank Riccardo Bernardini, who has put heart and soul into creating this gathering under extremely difficult and complicated circumstances. And I'd also like to say that for, I don't know how many Saturday mornings for the last couple months, Murray, Joe, and Ricardo have had telephone calls for us very early in the morning, figuring out whether this conference would be live. Anyway, I'd also like to thank my husband, Joe Cambray, who's been my friend and supporter, and he's been willing to put up with me for all these years. I love how there's such an interesting interweaving of the different presentations, and I was fascinated by what Hae-Young had to say about emotion and the heart and so forth. And I was particularly interested, there was a very lovely lady back here who asked a question about child development and so forth, but I was curious about interested in what he said about the connection between grief and heart, grief and heart. And so a couple months ago, a dear friend of ours, Paul Littman from Western Massachusetts, died. And Joe and I got up early to attend his funeral online, and we couldn't get in no matter how hard we tried. So I finally gave up and decided to work on reading about Hermes in preparation for this talk. And it's from that reading that I came upon the connection of Hermes and Hestia. So thinking about Franny, his wife, who's still living, and Paul, I offer my gratitude to them as well. He was a psychoanalyst, but was passionately interested in Jung, and he wrote a wonderful book about dreams called Nocturnes, It is without question that we are living in titanic times. We know from the ancient Greeks that the Titans, unlike the personified Olympians, were imageless and formless, making their presence known only through large-scale forces of nature, such as fire, floods, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. For the past 2 years, we've been surrounded by an unrelenting global pandemic caused by a minuscule, invisible virus that has had titanic effects. And now we are faced with the unprovoked war in Ukraine that has caused abominable suffering for countless innocent people. Fears of nuclear decimation are ever present, causing a constant buzz of collective anxiety. Trauma is usually understood as something beyond human capacity for understanding. And like the Greeks, we too feel overcome by titanic forces that have burst forth from the depths of Tartarus. Sometimes I think that Rafael Lopez Pedraza wrote about the destructive forces of the Titans as a compensation to Jung's gravitation to archetypal structures and persistent moves toward integration. However, perhaps we can look to Mnemosyne, the Titaness of memory, who incarnates as her daughters, the Muses. Although, like the others from her race, she is imageless and formless, Dante Gabriel Rossetti beautifully portrays his imagining of her here. The invisible inspiration of memory holds forth as the Muses manifest in the arts of all kinds, and thereby perpetuate the continuity of culture, even under the most dire of circumstances. All art, literature, and music are experienced as present moments of the past. Infant researcher Dan Stern aptly notes that as soon as a present moment is acknowledged, that moment is part of the past. Indeed, the arts form connections and bridges through the ages and have potential to help sustain us during the current time. The voices, writings, and images from the dead continue and help to weave the much-needed containing fabric of collective culture. We are, and inevitably always, influenced by those who have gone before. Even though faced with chaotic forces, ongoing dedication to pursuing creative work is crucial nonetheless, and doing so can serve an ordering function individually and collectively. Jung persisted with his studies and writings through 2 world wars, and just as we are now, faced anxieties about nuclear destruction, as evident in correspondence that colleague Billy Brennan and I recently viewed at the ETH. Similarly, Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham continued their clinical practice and research with the war nurseries in Vienna and then outside London, producing 3 books between 1942 and 1944. So clearly throughout the collected works, and now with expanded background unearthed, translated, and made accessible by the scholars, Jung consistently used models, diagrams, maps, and mandalas as means both to cope with and contain potential uprushes from the unconscious. The actions of writing, drawing, and painting created much needed space to reflect on his experiences and to organize and orient himself. He privileged emotion and lived embodied life as portals into internal dialogue and as a thread to be followed for exploring unconscious complexes. Comparing the results of his own confrontation with the unconscious to those from across cultures through amplification reassured him of his own sanity. And at the same time, doing so allowed him to hold to his dedication to medicine and science while searching for his soul and the soul of the world, a prodigious undertaking from which we all have benefited, and that is the fundamental motivation for us to gather together for this conference. It's so interesting throughout the conference how we all come back to this first mandala over and over. As we know, in January 1916, at a turning point moment in Jung's personal and professional life, and at a turning point moment in world history, he was confronted with ghostly presence who rang the doorbell at 228 Seestrasse. He was then inspired to create what he called his first mandala. And I'm going to say it in English because I want to keep coming back to the word system, the system of all worlds, and writing 7 sermons to the dead that from his view was central to all of his work to follow. It seems that he made for himself a containing structure that would hold his struggle with fears of dissipation into the pleroma that led to his ideas about the necessity of what he then called distinction as a kind of compensating limit. From his view, everything later was merely the outer classification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life, but the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then. So, from my view, the sense of the infinite of the pleroma both fascinated and attracted him, but he also seemed to sense dangers to his integrity and the need for boundaries and differentiation. The system he created in 1916 provided a map of the soul based on the constraints naturally arising from the tension of opposites, actually listed in 7 sermons, that would be a mainstay of his theories and models to follow. It seems to me that this first mandala helped to organize and orient Jung as he began to sense the vast territories to be explored that would unfold throughout his lifetime and ours. I am not so interested in focusing on the either ors of the opposites or balancing them, but I'm interested on the flux and flow of energy and movement in the liminal space in between, the space of creativity, of what I call fuzziness, or what Winnicott called the transitional space, where play and paradox have the freedom to configure and reconfigure as new patterns. For example, we may think here about the safety of the specific form of active imagination within the parameters of the rectangular box that Dora Kolff wrote about. And she talked about the importance of a free and open space in the sand play work. It's with these parameters that the patient is permitted to have an unfolding of the psyche under the watchful gaze of the therapist as witness and guide. Indeed, we imitate Jung, as all students imitate mentors, as means to develop fundamental skills that at first require explicit conscious attention, but that over time, with continued practice and experience, fall into the implicit procedural domain. I'll be saying more about that. For example, when learning to play the piano, specific conscious attention is required, but eventually, with some degree of native talent, it is possible to riff and improvise without specific conscious focus, with the capacity to move in individual and unique directions that take off from what has been studiously learned in training. And of course, I think this is true in analytic practice. McGilchrist, who writes about neuroscience, McGilchrist states that imitation gives rise, paradoxically as it may seem, to individuality. We are born into systems and are always and forever influenced by those around us. Innovation, says Stephen Johnson, who writes clearly and cogently about emergent complex adaptive systems, comes into being through interaction with others, usually without intention. New ideas do not spring forth as Athena, fully formed from the head of Zeus, but most often when in a relaxed state at the water cooler, in coffee houses or beer halls, in the context of engaged but not specifically directed conversation. Along similar lines, the infant researcher Beatrice Beebe has found that mothers who engage their babies with a mid-range of attention tend to lead to secure attachment patterns, whereas tightly bound, anxious maternal focus at one extreme or inattentive presence found with depressed mothers, for example, lead to less secure attachment patterns. This is highly relevant for the practice of analysis, going back to Freud's early ideas about evenly hovering attention. I'll say more about this later. Our work is to help create an analytic environment and atmosphere in the mid-range where unconscious processes can emerge as a transcendent third in the space between. Both Jung and Bion make similar statements about entering each hour free of memory, desire, and understanding. But we cannot forget that these two pioneers had substantial educational backgrounds, medical and psychiatric training, and well-integrated skill sets that were ever present. They could rely on organizing structures in the background of implicit memory that could be called upon when needed. With time, practice, and native talent, they had achieved the craft of the work as a professional secure base leading up to the art of the work. In other words, once a skill set has been mastered, then it is possible to be open to process and play in the co-created analytic field. And Murray kindly and Thomas published a paper called Jung as Craftsman in one of the earlier volumes. In a sense, We are always influenced by those who preceded us as mentors, but from whom we must differentiate on the path toward finding one's own authentic voice as part of individuation. Harold Bloom very well addresses this issue in his famous book, The Anxiety of Influence. And we can imagine that his ideas are reasonable. His ideas are a reasonable way to understand the Freud-Jung painful separation. Interestingly, last week, my friend Billy Brennan and I found a letter at the ETH from Jung to Harry Murray, dated July 2nd, 1948, where Jung states, individuation does not isolate, it connects. Questions about imitation, influence, and skill development are related to how we think about teaching and passing on Jungian practices, such as active imagination and amplification, both of which I see as part of a continuum of systems for understanding the psyche and analytic practice. What approaches and teaching methods do we use now that will influence future generations? Okay, now this is sort of an extra. Let's see how much time I take up on this. Oh, that's Namasini. I forgot to show you her. That's the Namasini. I'm sure you've seen this before. Wrong way. I love this story. So somewhere around 1713, the composer and violinist Tartini had a dream, and the devil appeared and insisted that Tartini hand over his violin. The devil then proceeded to play the most incredibly magnificent piece of music that Tartini had ever heard. When he woke, he tried to write it down and play it on his violin, and he was so frustrated that it was not nearly as good as what he'd heard from the devil, that if he didn't need to make money, he would have broken his violin in half at the time. However, what we know from history is that it is one of the most complicated pieces of violin music to be played through the present time. And when he played it, Tartini, in his time, his audiences thought he was a polydactyl. The fretwork was so complicated, they thought he had a sixth finger. And a number of years back, Joe and I were at Tanglewood in Western Mass with Tom and Jean Kirsch, and we heard a lovely young man, Vadim Repin, play Tartini's The Devil's Trill. I'll never forget that. So this is an artist rendering of that moment. I show it here because it has to do with, I could practice, there's this idea of rule of 10,000, you practice something 10,000 times and you master it. Well, it turns out that's not really true, or some people say that Jung analyzed 10,000 dreams. Well, I could practice a piece of violin music 10,000 times and I would never get a dream like this. So what we're seeing here is a coming together of multiple systems embedded within systems within. So for Tartini to get this, native talent, practice, discipline, passion, interest, curiosity, creativity, and the numinous. I mean, it's all sort of there in one place. And I think I use this as an example. This just came to me this morning. Les kind of inspired me to sort of go off track a little bit. The paper I'm just about to publish in the JAP called Play and Paradox, what I found is neuroscientists like Jaak Panksepp and the psychoanalyst Winnicott and many other people feel that the brain in free play is very similar to the state of the brain in states of dreaming. So the state of the brain in dreaming is similar to the state of the brain in free play. So that's in the Play and Paradox paper. And I have found multiple sources who say that. So I'm offering this because it's this state that these magical things happen, at the water pool, when you're not trying. And I think that's the ideal state to be in analysis. But when you're new and you're nervous, you're thinking about what to do. It's like once you get the skills mastered, you can relax and create the environment that invites a kind of creative experience. So I've written in a number of places about the conjunction of infant research, Jungian analysis, psychoanalysis, and so forth. And this was an early paper, and I just put this up because it's easy to access on the ARIS website. I also want to be clear, Nancy said that Art and Psyche, we do some projects with ARIS, but not all of our projects with ARIS. However, this is on the ARIS Connections website, and this is about bidirectional influence in the Matisse-Picasso relationship and in clinical practice from the dynamic systems perspective. My husband, Joe, also writes about dynamic systems, but we've come at it from different angles. I first started my interest in attachment at Yale in the middle 70s. And then in 1979, I worked in a wonderful child and family mental health center. And I started reading the work of Dan Stern and the members of the Boston Change Process Study Group, who were looking, they were empirical researchers using microprocess videotapes, looking very carefully at the nonverbal interaction patterns between parents and babies, second by second, and applying their findings to adult analysis. And I'll say more about that. And for the last 20 years, my case consultant has been Beatrice Beebe, an infant researcher at Columbia who has a lab and 6 research assistants, and they do all this good. But she's also a psychoanalyst, so it's really been a wonderful combination. I'm most grateful to Beatrice for her help. And she's been tolerant of hearing my ideas about Jung along the way. And even curious. Okay, so throughout this paper, we will consider the resonance of intersubjective patterns at varying scales, from infant research to Jung's use of the amplification as another type of matching via collective mythological motifs that he sensed amplified his patient's struggles. From my view, contemporary concepts such as complex adaptive systems and theories of emergence that undergird contemporary infant research and their empirical findings as applied to adult treatment are highly relevant for analytic practice and are a natural continuation of what Jung intuited so long ago. Resonant patterning is apparent within systems and can be analogously found between systems at varying scales. We can look at the details of a specific personal dyadic interaction, the intrapsychic interrelationships of dream figures, and locate similar patterns embedded within mythological motifs, works of art, or large group behaviors. Each affectively conveys analogous universal human struggles. Again, there are many portals into the soul. That line came from something Murray said the other day. Jung himself states, even the most individual systems are not absolutely unique, but offer striking and unmistakable analogies with other systems. Further, the following description from information technology and cognitive scientists Ted Carmichael and Mizrad Hadjik in 2019, their ideas sound strikingly similar to Jung's ideas about amplification as a method of analogy. Oh, good, it may be large enough for you to read it. They say, there is an ever-growing understanding that similar features in complex systems across a diversity of domains may indicate similar fundamental principles at work, and as such, there is often utility in using the key features of one system to gain insight into the workings of seemingly distinct fields. Shifting from analogies across systems, Louis Sander, he's the grandfather of infant research. I love his work. Early pioneer of mother-infant research, considers evolving patterns over time in human development. This is very dense. I said to Beatrice one time, well, why don't people read Sander more? She said he's too dense. So this little citation, you'll get the idea of that, but it's important. When a flow of energy enters a matrix of sufficient complexity that is under constraint by certain parameters, it will emerge as a flow of recurrent pattern, each recurrence of pattern having features both of self-similarity and of singularity. That is, each recurrence of pattern both resembles previous patterns, but is unique in its own way. And I'll say that again. That is, each recurrence of pattern both resembles previous patterns, but is unique in its own way. Sounds very Jungian, I think. Certainly, We are both similar to other humans and simultaneously unique, and by necessity exist within limits of physical bodies bound by time and space. Each experience of the self and of others may be similar from one moment to the next, including ingrained tendencies and expectancies for repeating patterns. But each moment is unique, and we are unique within each new moment. Every individual is a system, and we are always and forever embedded within concentric circles of influencing systems that, within facilitating environments, allow for ongoing continuity and change, a key paradox of emerging life as described by Sander. A further elaboration of ideas about dynamic complexity comes from the neuroscientist Dan Siegel, who has a fascinating way to understand the flux and flow of energy and influence of systems. He sees the mind as non-local and not simply enskulled. Siegel describes the mind as emergent, self-organizing, and as existing within and between, embodied and relational. Siegel's ideas about the non-locality of mind and that we all are embedded within mind feels quite resonant with Jung's prescient notions about the collective unconscious and interconnection through the unus mundus. The psyche is both individual, internal, and all-encompassing as it surrounds us. The Jungian self is simultaneously the center and circumference. Although not always palatable, we live within an interlinked world that at best allows for a sense of belonging, and at worst feels intrusive and an impingement on our individuality. Nancy, I have till what time?
Until 12:35.
Okay.
But I'm going to warn you at 12:30.
Okay. So I've laid the groundwork with Jung's first mandala, the system of all worlds, and I've emphasized some fundamental concepts about emergent systems as I intend to look at the resonance and interpenetration of three specific systems and their relevance to clinical practice. Further, I will look to Hermes as the god of movement and Hestia, the goddess of permanency, as the mythological pairing that I believe amplifies the interconnection within and between these systems. I'll bring together the well-known image of Sol and Luna from the psychology of the transference, derived by Jung from alchemy, along with Mario Jacobi's schematized version, looking at transference, countertransference, and add a model of cross-modal matching from infant researcher Colwyn Trevarthen. I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to show you the three. So Jung's first mandala was called the system of all worlds, and today I emphasize the word system as I intend to look at the interpenetration of three systems. Okay. Sol and Luna represent an amplification through alchemical metaphors and help with a visualized image that includes the cross currents of interaction that lead to the transcendent function. I could say there's a lot to say about that, but you're very familiar with it. I've had students that ask me questions. You know, you could imagine the transcendent function above, what's coming up from below. And I began to think about this image. It would be wonderful if you imagined it within a sphere and had multiple ways of thinking about it. And that has sort of evolved into a model that I'll show you in a moment. Also, this image from Mario Jacobi, in doing consultation groups at Pacifica, I found this really helpful with new therapists learning about depth psychology. And I had one group for 2 years. There were only 5 of them. And we got to know each other really well. And one guy was always having trouble with narcissistic male patients. And I would tell him about a book called Shame, the Underside of Narcissism, to try to help him get a sense of empathy for his patient, but empathy for himself. He was split from that. And over time, using this diagram really helped him, but really helped the group to kind of map out the dynamics of what was happening with the patient in a very practical way. Also at Pacifica, in teaching about the nonverbal implicit domain, I do a lot of teaching and so forth ahead of time, but then we do case presentations where one of the students embodies as best they can one of their own patients, psychologically, emotionally, bodily. And then I at first play the role of the analyst, and I try to demonstrate how I work with the nonverbal implicit domain through empathy with head movement, voice tone, so forth and so on. We film 10 minutes worth, and then we feed it back to the group and discuss it. And I just find it an enormously helpful method of teaching. And we also talk about amplifications and the psychodynamics and transference. But this way, they can get a sense of the subtleties of nonverbal cueing and so forth. And I think that it's embodied experiences in analysis and in supervision are so much more valuable than just reporting. Okay. So this model is one that you will know the least about. This is from the work of Colwyn Trevarthen, an infant researcher in Scotland. Trevarthen's model of cross-modal matching will be the least familiar to you and offers a seemingly simplistic view of how mothers and babies communicate across different modes. For example, the baby might tap rhythmically using a hand and a spoon while sitting in a high chair when mother is cooking dinner. She then picks up the cue initiated by her tiny partner and sings a tune with a similar rhythm and cadence while swaying her hips to the shared beat. Resonant matching, but through different modes. This kind of cross-modal matching takes place in the nonverbal domain of emotional communication, typical of interactions that predate the child's language development. Important to note is that cross-modal nonverbal communications persist throughout the lifespan and actually shape verbal communication, usually outside conscious awareness. This nonverbal system is known as the procedural non-conscious and is part of the implicit domain that is differentiated from the explicit domain that tends to be conscious and verbally oriented. For example, we communicate implicitly through cycling states of resonant match and disruptive states of non-match with facial expression, voice tone, cadence, rhythm, head orientation, body posture, and so forth. Implicit communication is usually outside conscious awareness and subtly but profoundly shapes verbal interchange and operates as what Stern calls the something more than interpretation. Nonverbal implicit communication also shapes the transference, countertransference relationship. The procedural non-conscious, again known as the implicit domain, begins at birth and powerfully affects all human interchanges throughout the lifespan. It's not just what we say, it's how we say it. And there's a great deal that I could say about all of this, but the 1998 paper by Stern and the Boston Change Process Study Group is called the Something More Than Interpretation. And in that paper, they say that a well-timed and thoughtful verbal interpretation is certainly important, but their feeling is that even more important is something they call moments of meeting, where analyst and patient step outside the transference, countertransference relationship, and something very human happens between the two. We would see this as a kind of numinous moment or a moment of the transcendent function. I have another paper in the JAP looking at moments of meeting, dyadic states of consciousness, and the transcendent function. So sometimes a raised eyebrow can change the course of a conversation, and sometimes it can change the course of a relationship. And I just want to show you real quick some. I can't go back. So this is a picture of the lab. These two are actually face to face. It's a split screen so you can see both the mother. So this to me is an image of what a moment of meeting looks like. And a patient brought this in after a particularly meaningful session that it felt like we really connected on multiple levels. Set the God before you, the God in his beginning, and behold it and incubate it with the magical warmth of your gaze. Somehow I've gotten lost. don't know how to get to. Joe, can you help me with this? I can't get it to go back.
Is it previous? Go to previous?
Just wanted to go back. Mhm.
And then just use the keys.
Oh. Mhm.
The arrow keys.
Okay. So these are about states of match and non-match. It's not just babies and mothers. This is Joe in China. Young would love this. So that's a yin yang. I was shopping that day. Joe went to a temple. Look what happens. That was totally spontaneous, by the way. And that's me with a cat. So, and the change process group talks about implicit relational knowing, a kind of knowing that's nonverbal. I think that's extremely important. Okay. Amplification, when used well, is an art characterized as nonlinear and ambiguous. Amplification is not necessarily employed with explicit intentionality, but is instead an emergent phenomenon that captures the essence of the psychological emotional constellation, often initially presenting in vague sensations or as fuzzy and unclear images. It connects the personal and the archetypal and emerges as a co-creative process. With careful attention to the analysand's explicit verbal and implicit nonverbal responses, engagement in metaphorical language and image have the potential to connect body, mind, and soul within the containing relationship and with the natural world. Through playful exchange, an image comes into being and is elaborated, ultimately representing a synthesis of the interaction of two minds, two bodies, two psyches, meeting consciously, unconsciously, and non-consciously as a dyadic state of consciousness, a moment of meeting, or a moment of the transcendent function. We struggle to find words to describe the experience. Perhaps that is why the indirectness of metaphor is so valuable. I believe that what Jung called intuition may also have been in part causal, as I imagine that he quickly picked up on nonverbal communications through implicit knowing outside conscious awareness and was able to match his patient's emotional states with resonant expressions conveyed through his face, body movement, voice tone, rhythm, and so forth. Of course, he was highly intuitive, but I think there's an element that was causal and nonverbal. Given Jung's sensitivity, extensive fund of knowledge, and first-rate psychiatric training, along with his avid curiosity, I think that he had an extraordinary capacity to meet the other on multiple levels at the same time, thus offering those in his care a sense of cohesion in the moment, leading coherency of self over time, an idea from Dan Siegel, the neuroscientist. This kind of multi-level alignment of resonant systems often brings with it a sense of wholeness and that something new has been born. With significant skill, knowledge, and expertise, I believe that Jung could experience vibrations from seemingly unrelated systems by using all of his senses to open to the emergence of images, connecting himself and the patient to the current moment, to the ancestors, and to the unfolding future. So I think you can pick up subtle cues at a body level, but I also think you can go to an opera and see a story, hear beautiful music and a symphony, and it stimulates it. So you go from image, large myth, and it affects you on a micro level. So you can go from the micro to the macro to the micro. So the slide of interpenetrating systems, what I'm interested in is the creative space in between. And my friend Billy helped me create this image, and I will just talk a couple minutes about it and finish. I imagine the slides that I showed you, Saul and Lona, Mario Jacobi's idea about transference, countertransference that has clinical utility, and then the slide of cross-modal matching. So the circular spiral, red, is Hermes, and the central axis is what I imagine to be, thank you, is what I imagine to be Hestia. Let me just say a few things about these two. Hermes, the invisible god of rapid motion, who transcends boundaries in time, in relation to Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, whom I see as representing the central axis or stationary point, much needed for human life as a secure base, a term with which we all are familiar from John Bowlby. Especially during times of crisis, such as our present moment, there's a natural inclination for all of us, regardless of age, to seek out loved ones, memories, images, or places that offer us a sense of holding within a secure base as a means to cope with both outer and inner turmoil. Hestia stands in a central position. As we will see, she is a portal into the worlds above and below. There's more that I certainly could say about these two, but I'm going to skip and finish up. I imagine Hermes as the invisible god, the god of energy, flow, movement, connecting domains above, below, and in the middle. In fact, he's the god of in-between spaces, in Greek metaxi, the human place between two poles, the finite and the infinite, the arena of our analytic practice. Hermes represents the ever-present flow within the co-created field. In Resonance, Lopez Pedraza says that this kind of psychic movement lies not only at the core of psychotherapy, but of life itself. He sees Hermes as a borderline god, the connection maker, the messenger who links the gods and goddesses to one another and to humans as he permeates the entire world. Hermes represents a kind of life force presence who swiftly and usually outside conscious awareness brings a sense of communion at the microcosmic level, in the interstitial spaces within oneself, or, for example, in the mother-infant relationship, and links the personal to the macrocosmic level when an archetypal pattern from myth resonates with a dream or life experience. And then I'll finish up with this. Further, at this moment in time, we need the complementary presence of Hestia. We need the complementary presence of Hestia, who can be likened to the mast of a ship or a portal that provides a channel of communication between separate and isolated cosmic levels, and offers the path of exchange with the gods below and the gods above, thus joining the universe together. Bernat makes the case that Hestia represents the principle of permanence, as well as the contrasting principle of movement, since she relates the above and the below. In so doing, Hestia and Hermes are united as a couple, joining in an inseparable friendship, the goddess who immobilizes space around a fixed center, and the god Hermes, who renders it unendingly mobile in all its parts. We might think of Hestia as a firmly planted, reliable, secure base and portal into other worlds, while Hermes might be thought of as the emotional energy that begins at birth and that invisibly binds and connects us to others and to the universe as a whole. Hestia and Hermes seem to hold inherent paradoxes within and simultaneously operate as a complementary pair, much needed at this time. These mythological figures have transcended the millennia and represent for us now what Sander describes as the polarities of continuity and change that are essential for life. Thank you.